Welcome to the History in 60 podcast, a companion series to AMI's History in 60, hosted by John Loeppky, exploring powerful moments in Canada's disability history. Here on the podcast, we take a deeper dive through conversations with guests who are shaping disability culture and history today.
Wheelchair rugby was born in Manitoba in the 1970s, created by quadriplegic athletes who demanded a sport of their own. What started as a grassroots game known as Murderball quickly grew into one of the most exciting sports in the Paralympic Games, spreading to over 40 countries around the world. Our guest today is Jessica Kruger, a Canadian wheelchair rugby athlete who has competed at the provincial level and represented Canada as part of its growing national women's program. Jessica brings a unique perspective on how the sport fosters connection, how it's evolving around gender and ability, and what's next for wheelchair rugby in the country. Hi, Jessica. Thank you for joining us on the History in 60 Companion podcast.
My name is Jessica Kruger, and my background is very boring. I'm in my new home in my office, and we haven't painted yet, so it's just a white background and a room full of boxes that you can't actually see.
And I'm here in our podcast studio setup here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, with the History in 60 logo behind me. When we moved into our house, we painted most of the wall, and then my wife and I lost the energy. So there was for a long time, there was a long strip of white that you couldn't see unless I tilted the camera up. So
I like it.
So if we'll start with the question that you've probably been asked a billion times, so allow me to be a billion and one. How'd you get into wheelchair rugby?
So I had a spinal cord injury when I was 15, and I was super active before I had that accident. I played like basketball, volleyball, did cheerleading. So naturally, I was looking for a sport to get involved in after I had that accident, and wheelchair rugby was kind of the natural fit given the fact that I'm a quadriplegic. So while I was in rehab, GF Strong, I had a rec therapist introduce me to the sport, and I fell in love. So 18 years later, still playing wheelchair rugby.
Someday, as a disability history show, someday somebody should do a whole list of how many athletes got recruited at GF Strong.
Yeah, I bet you it's a good percentage of them.
Yeah, for those that don't know, GF Strong is the main rehab hospital in Vancouver. So when we were working on this episode, which is about the history of wheelchair rugby, Ashley Monroe, a player for Calgary, who I know you know well, told me that getting into a sport like wheelchair rugby really helps with building a community. I certainly experienced that when I played, and also those sort of independent living skills of figuring out how to exist as a quad, basically. Did you find that to be true? And in your experience, and if you did, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I got involved in rugby so shortly after my accident that there was still so many things I wasn't doing for myself and so many things I didn't realize would be possible for a quadriplegic. So I got to rugby and I saw there's Paralympians in the mix, people that have been married, people that have a higher level of disability than me that are figuring out ways to do transfers that I didn't know I would be able to do, that have cars and drive. And I think it was a big eye opener for me for what was going to be possible. And then all of that added pressure from my teammates to kind of figure things out a little bit faster. I had a ramp van when I initially had my accident, and there was a few comments being made about it might be time to figure out how to transfer in and out of a car. And while it might not sound like the most supportive environment, it was ultimately the best thing that I could have had, because it pushed me to become so much more independent than I would have been had I not been introduced to those people that let me know that was possible.
Yeah, for the episode we shot at a tournament in Red Deer, I was saying to our crew when we went there, I can only explain the culture of wheelchair rugby so much before you just have to experience it. You just have to experience three quads in a circle arguing with each other with, a quad flipped over, and they're still the one talking the loudest.
Yeah. Totally.
Do you remember some of those, what were some of those early things that you mentioned, transferring into a car? Was there anything sport related that comes to mind from those early times?
Travel was definitely a big thing. I think probably my second year of playing wheelchair rugby, we did within Canada travel. We went to Ontario, Saskatchewan, a few different places. And again, I didn't know that someone in a chair could get on and off a plane. These were things that I had never been exposed to before that. So opened my eyes and made me realize that I would be able to still have that be a big part of my life.
Yeah, the hour it takes to get a quad rugby team on an airplane. Not quite. Depends how many
Depends on
aisle
how many.
So you've been a long time part of the provincial setup with Team BC, and now part of the growing contingent of women competing nationally and internationally. Can you tell me a little bit about, from your vantage point, how the sport has grown when it comes to gender diversity?
When I joined the team, there was one other girl that played for BC. So that was nice for me at the time because I was 15 when the rest of the team was like 20 or 30 plus. So I was the youngest as well as one of the only females. And then I don't know, she retired a couple years after that. I was the only woman on the team for, I want to say, probably 5 years. And then in the last 5 years, we now have like 4 or 5 women that play in BC. We can make up our own lineup on the court and have that moment, even though we're on the co-ed team here in BC. And yeah, it's exciting to see that. I think that when I started, there was probably like 10 women in Canada that play wheelchair rugby. And I don't know what the number is now. Hopefully you can do that in your fact checking.
I'm trying to do the math in my head.
Yeah.
But
it's a lot more than 10 for sure.
It's a lot more than 10, that's for sure.
So yeah, it's been exciting to see not only that more women are learning that the sport exists, but also they're reaching that competitive level where, we're at a point where we can look at having a women's team for Canada.
Who are some of the folks that you looked up to when you were starting in the sport, and what made you gravitate towards those people?
It was definitely Erica Schmutz and Miranda Beletsky that were kind of my icons to look up to. They were the 2 women that cracked the national team. So not only did they crack the team, but they were incredible athletes amongst their male counterparts. So yeah, just seeing how hard they worked to get there and how dominant they were in that space definitely were the 2 that I was able to look up to.
Miranda was a teammate of mine in Saskatchewan, and I used to jokingly refer to myself as the puppet with function, because as a 3-5, it was like Miranda and Britt tell me where to go, and I go wherever they tell me to go. And
there you go.
And Corey tells me when I've done something wrong, and
yeah,
that was my experience in wheelchair rugby.
I think people underestimate how much knowledge of like the plays and the game is required to really excel at wheelchair rugby. So you see in those athletes that might have less physical function based on their disability, the brain is working 5 times harder than everybody else, and they know not only where they need to be, but where everybody else on that court needs to be. So I'm sure you see Miranda playing that role pretty often.
And especially when a low-class player gets stuck in a corner somewhere where the rest of us would have our head down. They're thinking, ooh, what angle do I need to tell everybody else to go? You mentioned, having more women and looking at an international, level program. I know, and I saw the photos on Instagram of you in Prague at this tournament last fall. Can you talk to me about that next step with the national program and sort of what it means to you to be in that kind of structure and space, making that trip for Canada?
Yeah, so this is the first time that an all-women's team has been sent to compete in a co-ed tournament, I believe, in the world. Definitely first time for Canada. So this is Canada's women's development team. So definitely still growing this team and working towards more opportunities for women, but felt pretty incredible to be setting the standard for what this can look like for women in wheelchair rugby. And while we didn't necessarily have the results that we were hoping to get while we were in Prague, the experience was incredible, and just the opportunity to play with so many talented women from across the country. We just haven't been given those opportunities until now. So not only locally, but now internationally, it's pretty exciting.
As you mentioned, wheelchair rugby is co-ed. It's been co-ed basically from the start, but it's one of the few co-ed Paralympic sports. I'm trying to think of the other ones. Para hockey, which has way less women representation on the international stage than even wheelchair rugby has had. How do you think wheelchair rugby sort of makes that transition to having this women's program in a way that is sort of equitable to the team members? Because I always found it interesting to go from my own experience. Obviously, you don't need white bearded super crip to explain things to people, but I found the single single gender teams, because I played wheelchair basketball. So you only got up to single gender teams when you got to the national team. And I always found them really odd environments because I'd been co-ed all the way through. So I'm just curious, how do you think that this transition to this new era of wheelchair rugby could be done in a way that, best supports the athletes?
I think there's two sort of lines of thinking here right now. And it's interesting to see who feels what way about the situation. Because from my perspective, I would have guessed that the women that are on the co-ed national team would want to keep a co-ed national team because they had to work very hard to get a spot on that team. And that hasn't really been what I've seen. I've seen those women excited that there is an opportunity for more women to get involved, and they recognize that that's going to happen by having the fully female team. So it's going to be interesting to see how it happens. It sounds like right now they're trying to introduce the women's team while maintaining the co-ed system, which I think is great because that allows the choice for those that are able to crack that co-ed team to continue with those athletes, but it also provides the additional opportunities for those of us that weren't ever able to crack it, whether that's because of our gender or who knows what is working against us in those situations. But yeah, I'm curious to see kind of what direction it goes. I assume at some point it'll become a male and a female separated situation, but right now I think we're going to keep both, and that makes the most sense to me as we figure out what the women's game is going to look like.
Fair enough. And maintaining the co-ed structure presumably makes it trans inclusive for those athletes who may be looking at that pathway in a way that a split gender, not putting any words in Wheelchair Rugby Canada or the Canadian Paralympic Committee's mouth here. I don't know for sure. That's my armchair curiosity there. But and how do you see the impact that these additional opportunities for women in the sport, how do you see that filtering down into grassroots? Because a national program is only as good as the provincial programs can make it be.
I mean, as I said, for our local provincial team, we've 5+ the number of women on the team. And I think that that's because more women are aware that wheelchair rugby is a co-ed sport because they're seeing us on the larger scale. And it becomes less intimidating to join if you know that there's going to be other women out there with you. And trying to come into a totally male-dominated sport can be a little bit intimidating to some people for sure. So it's exciting that that's kind of changing the way that women look at the sport.
Obviously, this episode of the TV show that this podcast is companioning, I'm not sure if that's a word, but I'll decide. I'll just say it is about the history of wheelchair rugby. It's rare to be in a sport where one of the founders is still alive and around the sport. You share a province with him these days. I'm curious your thoughts as an athlete who's seen Duncan around many a gym, and what it's like to still hear the war stories of days gone by in a way that you wouldn't have with maybe some other sports.
Yeah, I actually had the honor of sharing a wall with Duncan Campbell for many years. We were neighbors, so I know Duncan very well. And it's amazing to not only see what he's created, but to see how he's continued to recruit for the sport and really advocate for it. I think it's so cool to have one of the people that actually invented it still out there kind of rooting for it and encouraging people. And I can't imagine what it's like for him to see what started as them throwing a basketball into a garbage can in Manitoba has grown into this international kind of phenomena. It's that must be so cool. And he's the most humble human ever. So probably he doesn't have the ability to absorb what an epic thing they've created. But yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the growth of wheelchair rugby, and we certainly saw this in the episode, of how you don't have wheelchair rugby if you don't have the rehab therapist folks in that gym or the people around that gym to grab equipment. You don't have the sport without folks figuring out how to get onto the Paralympic program. You don't have the sport without really quick buy-in comparatively with our neighbors down south and across the pond. Just to go back to that tournament in Prague, I saw you post on social media in that tournament in Prague. I also saw you responding to comments of people, I want to travel, but I can't travel. What impact do you think a tournament like that has outside of the sphere of the sport itself? When people who may never get into a rugby chair, but they're seeing the ancillary athletes traveling and things like that. What impact do you see that having?
The only reason I choose to share those pieces of my life on social media is because I hope that somebody that might not think that's possible is going to recognize that it is. And I think in general, that is the feedback that I've been seeing is people are like, oh, wow, I have more function than you and I'm not traveling or whatever. I didn't know that was possible. And there's so many unknowns as living life as a person with a disability that if you can kind of shine some light on those areas that people might not get to see otherwise, hopefully that's going to inspire them in some way to, think outside of the box and do some things that they never thought was going to be possible for them.
Is there a part of Canadian disability history that you wish we talked more about?
I think the thing that I find myself thinking about is like the idea of segregation and how recent it has been that we start trying to make spaces more inclusive for humans with disabilities. I was in Montreal for work last year and learned that they still have segregated schools for people with disabilities, and just the fact that that we haven't gotten to a place where we recognize that we don't need to separate humans just because they're different feels crazy to me. Maybe it's not one specific moment in disabled history, but yeah, it's just interesting to look at in some ways how far we've come, and in many ways how far we still have to go in that area.
Yeah, you were talking about having a new house and sharing a wall with Duncan. Yeah, someday somebody's got to write a history on the sort of like the disability community that has grown out of those BC sort of co-op housing spaces where
Yeah.
because it's inevitably I go, do you know somebody? And they go, yeah, they're my neighbor.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sure.
Within like 2 blocks in Vancouver, we've had like Trevor Hirschfield, the wheelchair rugby Canadian national team. I moved into his old apartment, and Julia Haynes just moved into my old apartment. She's a wheelchair rugby athlete as well. And Pete Isherwood, a Paralympic table tennis player now. Like we're all within that same little sphere, and we all know each other and respect what one another does. And I think we grow from living in those shared spaces with each other as well.
Wheelchair rugby is a rough and tumble sport with a rough
Once
and tumble.
known as Murderball.
Exactly, with a rough and tumble past, and in some areas, hopefully people won't mind me saying this, a rough and tumble social scene as well, at various parts of its history. What's people's reaction when you tell them that you play the world's basically one of the only full contact wheelchair sports?
I don't think people even begin to understand what it actually is until they come and see it. Like you tell them it's a full contact sport, and then they come and they see a chair smash into it to the point where the person is now laying on the ground. It's hard to really imagine how vicious it can be at times until you're in the gym and just hearing that smashing of metal. That's when people are like, oh, wow, you really mean it's a full contact sport. I think wheelchair rugby also, people say the name and they're like, oh, okay, so do you have scrums? Do you pass backwards? How do you push your chair on a field? And it's like, well, the name is a little bit misleading because it actually has very few similarities to the non-disabled version of rugby. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing too, is it's like, no, it's actually kind of like full contact basketball in some ways, but you have possession of the ball and wheel across the line to get a goal. And yeah, it's interesting just from the name. It doesn't really tell you much about the sport. The previous name of Murderball almost tells you a little bit more, but just not as marketable, unfortunately, on that Paralympic stage.
Yeah, and I think it's the team in Seattle. You would know better than me because you're geographically closer. I was at a tournament, the Vancouver Invitational. Their support team had pit crew on their shirts.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the vibe of what's happening. What was your family's reaction? You mentioned, you started playing rugby shortly after you got hurt. Mm-hmm. What was your support system's reaction to, I just had this traumatic lived experience and now I'm going to go slam into other disabled people for fun?
What could go wrong? Honestly, they were very supportive. They knew how badly I needed sport, and they saw that gave me a place to be an athlete. Sport after disability is like the one spot you come to where it's not about being a disabled person, it's about being an athlete. You get to lose that title for a second, and I think they saw what that meant to me, so it was okay. Maybe the one part that was a bit intimidating for them was their 15-year-old daughter traveling with 30-plus-year-old men. That dynamic was a little bit strange, which, again, something with the women's movement might make younger women more likely to get involved in the sport because that can be a bit of an intimidating situation. But yeah, the sport itself, they were on board with. They saw my love for it and they knew they weren't going to be able to pull me away.
Thanks for joining us, Jessica. If people want to find your work now in the various areas of work that you do on and off the court, where would you send them to?
If you're interested in me sharing my travel and conversation around disability, accessibility, This Stubborn Life on TikTok is where I'm mostly posting that.
Got it.
Even with
Thank
that
you.
stubborn brand, make it easy. Thanks, John.
Today's conversation shows how wheelchair rugby is about much more than just competition. It's a story about disabled athletes demanding space, building something new, and creating opportunities that continue to change lives on and off the field of play.
Thank you for tuning in to the companion podcast for AMI's History in 60. Be sure to watch History in 60 on AMI TV and online at AMI Plus. Join us next time as we continue exploring disability history and culture in Canada. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing, downloading, and sharing it with someone who might learn from these stories. Every listen and view helps amplify disability history and the voices shaping change today.